CEO fires janitor, not realizing who his family really is. Have you ever been judged based on your job, your appearance, or your status in life? Imagine someone important in your life being dismissed, mistreated, or even fired, only to later realize that they're far more important than you could ever have imagined. This is the story of a janitor who was fired by a CEO, only to reveal his family's true identity, a revelation that would change everything. Stay with me as we dive into this shocking tale of arrogance, karma, and the power of understanding true worth. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the sleek glass-paneled office building where the CEO of Green Tech Solutions worked. Inside the building, the atmosphere was one of high-powered business deals, wealth, and ambition. The employees hustled through the halls in sharp suits, always moving fast, always thinking about their next move. It was a place where status and wealth defined people, and one's role in society was often measured by what they did rather than who they were. In the corner of the building, tucked away from the bustling offices, was the janitor's closet. It was a modest space filled with mops, buckets, and cleaning supplies, unnoticed by the powerful executives who passed it by every day. One man spent his hours there, ensuring that the offices were spotless and the hallways were pristine. George, the janitor. George was in his early 50s with graying hair and worn-out clothes. He had worked at Green Tech Solutions for years, quietly performing his duties with dedication. No one in the building seemed to notice him, except for when they needed a trash can emptied or a spill cleaned up. He was just another figure, another worker among many, not important enough to be acknowledged by the high-powered employees who walked by without a second glance. But one man who passed him every day did notice him: CEO Richard Green. Richard Green was a powerful and wealthy man, the founder and CEO of one of the largest tech companies in the city. He was known for his sharp business acumen and cold, calculating demeanor. Richard had a way of making people feel small, no matter who they were. If you didn't hold a position of power, you didn't matter. He had always viewed people like George, the janitors, the custodians, the maintenance workers, as expendable. To Richard, their jobs were menial, unimportant tasks, just as invisible as the dust that George would often clean up. One day, as Richard strode through the hallway on his way to an important meeting, he noticed George sweeping the floor, his head down and focused on his work. Richard, in a fit of impatience and irritation, snapped at George. "Hey, are you even doing anything? The floor looks terrible. You're supposed to make it shine, not look like this." Richard's voice was cold and commanding, his tone carrying an air of superiority. George, who had been a humble man for most of his life, stood up straighter and looked Richard in the eye. He had heard the complaints before. Comments about his work, comments about his job, comments about his place in the world. But this time, something in Richard's words hit a nerve. Without thinking, George responded with quiet dignity. "I'm doing my job, Mr. Green," George said calmly, his voice steady. "I've been here for years, and I've always given my best." Richard's eyes narrowed and his face twisted in annoyance. He saw George as a mere servant, a worker meant to stay in his place. His patience was thin, and his temper had flared over the years of working with people who, in his mind, were beneath him. "I don't care if you've been here for years," Richard sneered. "If you can't keep this place clean, maybe it's time for you to leave. You're not doing a good enough job, George. I'll have HR call you later." With that, Richard stormed off, leaving George standing in the hallway, his heart sinking. George had heard this kind of talk before. He knew the power dynamics in the building, the wealthy executives who felt superior to everyone else. He had worked his whole life not for praise or recognition, but to provide for his family. And yet, here he was, being belittled by a man who thought nothing of him. As promised, HR called George later that day to inform him that his services were no longer needed. Richard had made the decision to let him go, and there was nothing George could do about it. He had no other job lined up, no other option. His heart felt heavy, but there was little he could do. It wasn't the first time someone in a position of power had treated him this way, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. But what Richard didn't know was that George wasn't just a janitor. He wasn't just a man doing menial labor for a living. George had a history that Richard couldn't even begin to comprehend. George didn't need to tell anyone his story, but there was a reason he had come to Green Tech Solutions all those years ago. George had come from money, a lot of money, but it had all been taken from him. Years ago, George had worked in finance, living a comfortable life in an expensive house. But after a series of disastrous business deals, his wealth and his family had evaporated overnight. He had lost his job, his reputation, and ultimately his fortune. But he had rebuilt. He had done so quietly, with humility. He found peace in simpler things, and though his life had taken a different turn, he was still proud of the person he had become. What Richard didn't know, what no one in the building knew, was that George had connections far beyond anything he could imagine. The family George had once been part of still held immense influence, and they had always looked out for him. The next day, a meeting was scheduled in Richard's office. As Richard sat behind his desk, reviewing reports, he received a sudden phone call from his assistant. "Mr. Green, we have a visitor here to see you. His name is George. He says he's here to speak to you." Richard's face scrunched in confusion. "George? Who is that?" "The janitor," the assistant replied, her voice unsure. Richard chuckled under his breath. "Send him away. I don't have time for that." But the assistant hesitated. "Actually, sir, he insists on seeing you. He says it's very important." Richard leaned back in his chair, slightly irritated. "Fine, send him in." A moment later, the door opened, and George walked into the room, dressed not in his usual janitor's uniform, but in a sharp suit and tie. Richard raised an eyebrow, his confusion deepening. "George," Richard said, his voice uncertain. "What are you doing here?" George smiled, but there was no humor in it. "I think it's time you know who I really am," he said. Richard, still sitting behind his desk, felt a chill run down his spine. "I'm not sure what you mean. You're a janitor. You don't—" Before Richard could finish, George interrupted. "I'm not just a janitor, Mr. Green. My name is George Montgomery, and I was once a senior partner at Montgomery Financial. But after a series of unfortunate events, I chose a simpler path in life. My family still has major stakes in businesses across the country. I have connections to people you could only dream of, and those connections, well, they're about to change everything for you." Richard's jaw dropped. His mind raced as he tried to comprehend what he was hearing. The janitor, this humble, quiet man, was one of the most powerful figures in the country. Before Richard could respond, George continued, "I don't care about your company, Richard, but I care about the way you treat people, and I think it's time for you to learn a lesson in humility." A few days later, Richard received a letter from a law firm representing George's family. The letter, formal and concise, explained that Green Tech Solutions had been found in violation of several labor laws and was being investigated for improper treatment of its employees. A large sum of money had been set aside as part of a settlement, and it would be used to fund employee welfare programs. Richard's company was going to pay the price for its treatment of George and the other workers like him. This story teaches us a powerful lesson. Never judge someone based on their job, appearance, or perceived worth. Everyone has their own story, and you never know who might be standing in front of you. It's easy to overlook or dismiss others, especially when we think we're in a position of power. But as George's story shows, life has a way of humbling even the most arrogant. Respect for others, no matter their status, is something we all must remember if we want to build a truly just and compassionate society.